It is April 24th, 2025, and Trump is back to lashing out at everyone from Putin to Zalinsky. He's claiming he just wants to make a deal to end the war in Ukraine, and yet he doesn't seem to be doing anything from what we're seeing to actually end U.S. support, the U.S. enabling of that war in Ukraine. So, where does that leave us? Are we going to get talks anytime soon? Is the U.S. actually going to walk away from it all? We'll be getting into all of that and more here in today's video. But before we do, Jax wanted to come back and to say hi to everybody. Can you say hi? And to let you know that we just hit 99,000 subscribers on YouTube, which is just insane. We are so close to 100K, and I am so excited to hit that milestone. I also wanted to say a special thank you to all of y'all who are continuing to reach out and to send donations and books to my P.O. box. I've got the information for that listed below. And also to those of y'all who have sent dog treats. Special shout out to Kevin in Texas this week who sent an entire box of dog treats. Jax was very excited, weren't you? It made his entire day. So thank you so much to all of y'all who are showing your support, not only virtually by signing up as a paid monthly subscriber or sending a one-time donation on Buy Me a Coffee, but those of you who are also sending direct donations to my P.O. box and books for my bookshelf behind me. I'm so grateful for all of y'all. I'm going to go lay Mr. Jax down for his nap now, and then we're going to get into the topic for today's video. All right, I got the little man his treats for his time on camera, laid him down for his nap, and now it's time to get into all of the latest. And we have quite a bit, as Trump has been very vocal on Truth Social. On Thursday, he posted this status in which he specifically called out Russian President Putin. And in it, he said, quote, "I am not happy with the Russian strikes on Kiev, not necessary and very bad timing. Vladimir, stop. 5,000 soldiers a week are dying. Let's get the peace deal done." Okay, so this status is being touted by the Western media as a rare rebuke of the Russian president coming from Trump, right? They're acting like Trump and Putin are old friends and allies, and now all of a sudden Trump is really calling Putin out. When in reality here, Trump is playing this game, right? We've seen him do this for a while now, even when he was campaigning for office. He just wants the war in Ukraine to end. He just wants people to stop dying. He just wants peace around the world. That's the game that Trump is playing. Now, of course, what he's not bringing up is the role that the U.S. is playing in continuing to enable this war, making this war possible in the first place. He's ignoring all that, but he doesn't need to bring that up because he's just going to keep calling out Russia and Ukraine because they are the ones who are continuing this war, at least in his little world in this game that he's playing. Now, Trump's post followed reports of an hours-long barrage of missiles and drones in Kiev on Thursday, which killed at least 12 people and left dozens of others injured, with Ukrainian officials reporting that multiple residential buildings were hit. Now, at the time of this recording, Russia has not said specifically what it was targeting. I know that in the past, when it has had attacks where residential buildings have been hit, it has said some version of "we only target military targets, we do not target residential buildings," and then on and on. So I'm curious to see what their statement is going to be from this. I also think it's notable that this attack seems like it was meant to send a message because, as we've seen here, look, we've had hours of talks between the U.S. and Russia, even directly between U.S. Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff and Russian President Vladimir Putin. So Putin has taken the time, he's engaged in these talks, and according to Witkoff, on their last round of talks, they ended it by setting up the framework for a possible peace deal. And ever since Witkoff made that announcement, Zalinsky's response has been to basically look for all of the ways that he can say no, right? No to recognition of the 5 new regions, no especially to recognition of Crimea, no, no, no. And so it would not surprise me whatsoever if Russia says, okay, well, Ukraine, Kiev, Zalinsky is making it clear that he is not going to agree to any kind of a peace deal. Therefore, we're still at war. Therefore, what's to stop Russia from targeting Kiev? And the US, Trump, they want to act like, oh, how dare Russia target the Ukrainian capital? It's like, well, first and foremost, they are at war. Again, we don't know what targets they were hitting, but this is a war. And the US is actively enabling one side of that war, and they have been for a number of years now. So the US is not an innocent party just looking in on this conflict between Russia and Ukraine and hoping that they can find some way to solve it, which is the way that Trump is trying to present it. And it's been interesting to watch here because one of these base provisions that Russia has said that they would require is the recognition by Kiev and by the US and I guess the West as a whole of these 5 new regions being part of the Russian Federation, that being Crimea, along with Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. Now, here's the thing. Crimea obviously has been reincorporated into Russia for more than a decade now, so that's should not be a sticking point. Zelensky's trying to make it a sticking point. But for these 4 other regions, these are the ones that held referendums in 2022 that, yes, they voted overwhelmingly to join Russia at the time. But as it stands today, Russia does not have full control of all 4 of those regions. So I could see this back and forth on why Putin is really making this an issue, saying, hey, we need this recognition because we don't have full control of these regions, but we recognize them as part of the Russian Federation under Russian law. And Zelensky seems to be still thinking that he's winning this war, that he has a chance to, or at least that's what whoever is in his ear is telling him to say. And he's continuing to say no and refusing any sort of workaround. And the crazy part to me is that after we had those talks between Witkoff and Putin, you had Witkoff talking about these 5 regions, right? Well, then the reports that we've seen this week have solely been focusing on Crimea. They've basically said, as if the Trump administration is saying, and yes, this is from anonymous sources. I will note that this is not from Trump directly that we've heard so far. But according to these anonymous sources who are said to be within the Trump administration, they're literally just bringing up the recognition of Crimea, the easiest piece to the puzzle. We don't have to argue over who has control of what. Russia has control of it and has for over a decade now. This should be a really easy thing for Kiev to say, you know what, sure, we're going to give Russia recognition of this territory, but Zelensky can't do that. And so, as a result, he has said publicly multiple times that that wouldn't happen, even saying at a press conference on Tuesday that, quote, Ukraine will not legally recognize the occupation of Crimea. There's nothing to talk about here. This is against our constitution. And I love how the guy who is only still in office because he keeps extending martial law, the guy who banned all of his major opposition and who nationalized the media in his country, he wants to sit here and talk about respecting the Constitution when it comes to Crimea, when the only reason that Ukraine lost Crimea in the first place in 2014 was because of the fact that Kiev was dealing with a Western-backed coup of the democratically elected government, and the new regime tore up the Ukrainian constitution. So I think Zelensky needs to backtrack a little bit if all of a sudden he's talking about, oh, we need to respect the Constitution when it comes to Crimea. Well, why don't you respect the democracy, the democratic rights of the people in Crimea who, as a reminder, 97% of them voted to join Russia in 2014. And it's interesting to see Trump now coming out and publicly blaming Putin for this Russian attack in Kiev when Zelensky is the one who is refusing even the most basic provisions of a deal. Like, at least Russia said, hey, we have some sort of framework for a deal. Zelensky's version of a deal is forcing NATO directly into this war, right? They want NATO membership for Kiev. They want NATO to be a party, even more so than it already is, to this war. They want to force NATO into World War III against Russia. And it should also be noted that Trump didn't spare Zelensky. He did criticize him. I'm not saying he didn't, because Zelensky's post from Trump came on Wednesday, also on Truth Social, and it was much longer and much more of a rant. And in it, Trump declared that Zelensky's statement was very harmful to the peace negotiations with Russia and that Crimea was lost years ago under the auspices of President Barack Hussein Obama and is not even a point of discussion. Nobody is asking Zelensky to recognize Crimea as Russian territory, but if he wants Crimea, why didn't they fight for it 11 years ago when it was handed over to Russia without a shot being fired? Now, first and foremost, Trump is not wrong about the fact that there was never a battle for Crimea in 2014. As I noted earlier, it was a peaceful referendum, right? People voted overwhelmingly to join Russia. They saw the chaos that was happening in Kiev at the time. They didn't want any part of that, and they voted accordingly, and they have lived accordingly for more than a decade now. Now, if Trump wants to blame the Obama administration for the coup in Kiev, he's absolutely right to do that, right? He can blame the likes of Victoria Nuland and John McCain and the other individuals. I would argue it was the entire US establishment that was responsible for it, but sure, he can lay out that blame all day long. But then you have the fact that Trump then says that no one is asking Zelensky to recognize Crimea as part of Russian territory. Well, according to these reports, that's exactly what the Trump administration was asking him to do. But it also brings me back to comments that we heard from Zalinsky previously, where he said something to the effect of, oh, yes, there will be a diplomatic settlement. He said that Russia would keep control of those territories at the time because Kiev just did not have the means to force Russia off of them. But then he also said that Kiev would never recognize those territories as Russian. So it makes me wonder if in these conversations behind closed doors, the talk is more along the lines of, let's get a Minsk type deal where we have some sort of an agreement, we freeze the conflict. Kiev says, yeah, they'll be peaceful. They won't target these territories. They quote unquote allow Russia to keep these territories or to draw the battle lines where they are currently. And then Kiev never actually recognizes those territories as legitimately part of Russia. And then we see, a new battle years down the road, if not months down the road. We see how long we can keep this conflict frozen. It makes me wonder if that's the talk that's actually happening behind closed doors, because with Trump's phrasing here, and maybe Crimea wasn't mentioned, maybe all of these reports are, going off of someone else in the Trump administration, and you had the president himself trying to kind of separate things here. That is a possibility. However, I also think it's likely that the conversation that's happening behind the scenes is to the effect of, let's just try to get Russia into a deal. Let's get some European troops in Ukraine and then go from there and prepare for what is going to be the next phase of this ongoing war. Now, the last thing I'll mention from Trump's status is that he goes on to say that Zalinsky is prolonging the quote unquote killing field. He keeps bringing up the stat saying that, 5,000 soldiers are being killed a week. I'm not exactly sure where he's getting his numbers, because this is a conflict where you don't exactly have everyone bringing up how many people they lost on their side, right? You have what Russia says about how many Ukrainians have been killed. You have what Ukraine says about how many Russians have been killed. You have the US and its version of it. So I'm curious to where Trump is getting his numbers here, but he's going right back to being the third party here, right? Claiming that, the US just wants a deal, and that's where it begins and ends. And then you have Zelensky's response. And in it, he posted on X a screenshot of the Crimea Declaration issued by former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in July 2018, which stated that the U.S. would not recognize Crimea as Russian territory, and it called on Russia to give it back to Ukraine. And I get that Zelensky is trying to remind Trump of what happened during his first term, right? The role that Trump played in escalating this conflict, because it wasn't just the Obama administration. No, it was the first term of the Trump administration. It was the Biden administration. And now it's Trump's second term. He is directly involved, whether he wants to admit it or not. But I also think it's a reminder. You look back at all of the ways in which the US has pushed Kiev forward, pushed them towards war with Russia, and done so purposefully. And it's a reminder that it's not like Kiev just picked a fight with Moscow, right? They decided that they were going to pick a fight with their much larger neighbor. No, they are in this because they felt that they had the full backing of NATO. They are in this because that's what they were told to do. They escalated because that's how they were told to act. And the US acts like, oh no, we're not involved. This war would not be happening today in the way that it is if it were not for the US. I would argue we would not see escalation to this point without the US. And Trump loves to say over and over again, this would not have happened if I were in office. And you know what? Sure, you can argue back and forth that we would not have had this exact same war. There would likely still be ongoing fighting in the Donbass. I mean, we would likely still have Kiev, I would expect, as they are right now, targeting the Donbass republics, targeting the people there who had decided that they wanted nothing to do with the new Western-backed Kiev regime. Would we have Russia recognizing those Donbass republics, declaring the start of a special military operation, then holding referendums in these 4 additional regions to join Russia? That's a good question. I don't know that we would have escalated to that point so soon. I do think it's possible that Trump would have pushed to kind of dial things back a bit, but that doesn't change the fact that the US was still engaging in a proxy war against Russia, even if it wasn't to the level that it is right now, where you have the US even more so directly involved. They were still arming Ukraine. They were still giving them lethal aid, and they were still helping them and preparing them for a future war with Russia. And Russia knew that. That's how we got to this point. And now you have the Trump administration ramping up its rhetoric about wanting to just walk away. We've heard it from Rubio, Trump, and even JD Vance. Now, I know that some of you may be getting excited at all of this talk, right? Thinking that, okay, maybe the US is actually going to walk away. Maybe Donald Trump is actually going to make it happen. I'm a little bit hesitant as to what he's actually going to accomplish. I will say that much. And that mainly stems from the rhetoric we've heard from other members of his administration. As we have to remember, it's not just Trump making the decisions. He has a full cabinet of neocons he's surrounded by. And listen, the US establishment controls US foreign policy at the end of the day. It's not Trump, not Biden, Obama, whoever's sitting in the Oval Office. That figurehead doesn't really matter. They may influence certain parts of it, but the train keeps rolling from one party to the next and from one administration to the next. And if you missed it, I would encourage you to go back and watch the video that I posted yesterday, my interview with Brian Berletic, because he brought up a really important point that really rings true when you're looking at the conflict in Ukraine. And that is what we're hearing particularly from U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, because he's the one that went before the Ukraine Defense Contact Group in Brussels back on February 12th, and he specifically told them that, quote, the U.S. is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity and making the resourcing trade-offs to ensure deterrence does not fail. Deterrence cannot fail for all of our sakes. As the United States prioritizes its attention to these threats, European allies must lead from the front. Together, we can establish a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and Pacific, respectively. So in other words, while we've seen all of these reports about conflict and friction between the Trump administration and its allies in Europe, what Hegseth is telling them is, hey, we need you guys to take on more responsibility. We need you guys to directly take the reins when it comes to this proxy war against Russia and when it comes to support for Ukraine. Similar language was also found in a reported memo from Hegseth to the Pentagon last month, which discusses plans to prepare for war with China. And it says the Pentagon will assume risk in other theaters, given personnel and resource constraints, and pressure allies in Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia to spend more on defense to take on the bulk of the deterrence roles against threats from Russia, North Korea, and Iran. So, this is the US establishment plan. It's been laid out in a number of different cases. This plan to prepare for war with China, to do to China what the US just did to Russia. And yes, that is even though the US did it to Russia unsuccessfully in a number of ways. We have to remember the goal here was to weaken Russia. The goal overall was to destroy Russia's economy, to harm the Russian people. I'm sure that the US had regime change in Russia in mind. Yes, absolutely. But they're also looking at the multipolar world. They're looking at the competitors, and they're seeing Russia as a rising competitor. And so, in the minds of these insane neocons in Washington, they see it as doing what they have to do to try to harm their competitors, to try to pull them back. They did it to Russia. It didn't matter how many Ukrainians had to die. They're still fighting to the last Ukrainian. And for the hawks in Washington, that's enough for them. Now they're looking at doing it to China. How many people are going to die, whether that be in Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, all of these different allies that the US is assembling in the region ready for war with China. The US is not sending American soldiers to die, not yet, not right now. They are fine with sacrificing their so-called allies. They're fine with sacrificing Europeans in the war in Ukraine. That's what they're building up to next. I know the Trump campaigned on this promise of peace, and I know that, he'll sit there and he'll talk about wanting to end the war in Ukraine, and that's all fine and good. But his speech is not matching up with what his administration is pursuing. And so, as much as we pay attention to all of the colorful social media posts and the commentary and hearing people like Trump and Rubio talking about wanting to walk away from the war in Ukraine, we also have to pay attention to what they're actually doing, what they're building up to, and what it means for the future of US foreign policy and the world as we know it. And that's something everyone should be talking about. If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also find Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.